my name's Anne
And I'm Tamara Loke.
and we are occupational therapists at the Center for Autism Services, Alberta. Today, we're here to talk to you about sleep. So we want to start off by saying these are some recommendations around sleep, and some may work for you as a family and some may not. If you have a team or clinician you're working with, I recommend talking about the strategies you hear about in this workshop with them to see what's going to work right for you. It's only an introduction to the variety of strategies around sleep. I'm sure as you've learned surfing the internet and whatnot, there's tons of recommendations out there. Our only goal for this workshop is that you, your kids, the dogs, your grandma, everybody sleeps better by the end of it.
We'll briefly go over the signs of sleep, and then we'll go into the common sleep problems that we see, and we'll also discuss how can we fix these problems.
So why sleep important? Well, you're not watching this workshop because you think you don't need any more sleep than you're already getting. There's a growing body of evidence out there around why sleep is important, not just for kids, but adults too. We know that children who sleep better do better at school. They tend to have better planning and problem-solving skills. They have fewer challenging behaviors like aggression, and they tend to also have better impulse control. Think about it. Let's say I slept in today or I didn't sleep very well last night. I would wake up in the morning, I'd forget to pack my lunch, I'd have way more road rage than normal, and come lunchtime, I was definitely going to McDonald's instead of getting a salad to eat. You just don't work as well when you don't have sleep. We also know that children with autism who have sleep challenges have more visits to the ER than their primary care physicians. And parents of children who have autism and also have sleep challenges are at an increased rate for depression, anxiety, obesity, and diabetes. Sleep impacts us all. It's not just our behavior, it's about our health and overall quality of life as well.
So what happens in sleep? There are 5 stages that happen in a sleep cycle, and these occur about 4 to 6 times per night. So the first stage is what we refer to light sleep. So this is when you're just starting to fall asleep, so you're still in that light stage. The next two stages is what we refer to as deep sleep and deeper sleep. Now, while there are slight differences between the two, the only thing that you and I need to know is that we're fast asleep in this stage. So for example, if your child is in either of these stages and the fire alarm goes off, they're probably not going to wake up. Whereas in a light sleep stage, the furnace could just turn on and suddenly your child is wide awake. So the next stage is what is called the rapid eye movement or REM sleep. And this is when we dream. So if we're woken up during this REM stage, we're more likely to remember our dreams. So this can explain why sometimes when we wake up, we can vividly recall our dreams, but sometimes we don't even recall dreaming at all. Finally, we have this transition stage, and during this transition stage, we're actually awake. And so when this phase occurs in the middle of the night, we're able to just roll over and fall back asleep. However, with our children with ASD, we find that our kiddos are actually waking up fully, and they're unable to fall asleep. And this could be because the environment that they're falling asleep in is different from the environment that they are waking up in the middle of the night. So let's just say you rub your child's back when they're falling asleep, but when they wake up in the middle of the night, you're already in your own room and they wake up and they're alone in the dark. So this is similar to falling asleep in your bed and then waking up in your front lawn. So you would completely wake up if that were to happen to you. So overall, as I mentioned before, this cycle happens 4 to 6 times per night, meaning we could be waking up every 90 minutes. So though waking up is often a normal part of sleep, we need to teach our children how to put themselves back to sleep on their own.
So sleep is impacted by many substances within our body and by our body's 24-hour clock. In terms of these sleep substances, those are often things like hormones. And as the day goes on, we slowly build up those hormones that make us feel sleepy. So kind of like those sleepy substances. Drinking coffee and taking a nap will decrease the amount of sleepy substances in our body, making us not want to fall asleep as early. Things like spending time in the sun will also decrease the amount of sleep in our body. That's why it's great to spend a little bit of time in the sun, especially during the day, and then less time in front of things that emit blue light, like screens and tablets, as the night goes on or the evening goes on. When our body is also controlled by a 24-hour clock that's built into us. It tells us when to wake up and when to fall asleep. So with my daughter, even if I was to keep her up till 10 p.m., maybe 11, a couple hours past her bedtime, she's still going to wake up at 6:30 the next day, no matter how much I want her to stay asleep. It's the same when we're flying. So we have jet lag. So when we travel to a new time zone, we still feel jet lag. Even if we had caffeine or we took a nap, we're going to feel really off in our sleep for the first few days.
As you can see in this chart, different age groups might need different amounts of sleep. So in general, the older we get, the less sleep we need. However, these tend to be general guidelines and just recommendations, as not every child will need the same amount of sleep. So some of us might be night owls or morning larks, and we actually don't need that much sleep to function.
So sleep challenges. So there's a variety of different things out there, and the ones that we're going to talk about today and the strategies we'll give you to support them are things like difficulty falling asleep or difficulty sleeping alone, whether that's right from falling asleep or throughout the night. Frequent waking, so that's waking up every 90 minutes like Tamara spoke about when she talked about the sleep cycles. Nightmares and sleep terrors, a little bit different, but similar strategies for both. Sleepwalking and bedwetting.
So the first thing we need to do is find out what that sleep challenge is and when is it occurring. So the best way to do this is to keep a sleep diary for at least 1 week to figure out if there are any patterns. Sometimes, especially if your child has more challenges in the middle of the night, you can use a video monitor to keep an eye on your children to see what they're doing before and after they wake up in the middle of the night. And this way you don't have to stay up all night and watch them like a hawk. So on the screen here is an example of a children's sleep diary. So you would record what time your child got into bed, how long it took for them to fall asleep, and whether or not they woke up in the middle of the night, how many times, and for how long as well. We also want to keep track of their eating habits, any caffeine intake, their medication, and physical activity. All of these things greatly impact sleep, and so the more information you get, the better.
So sleep isn't just about habits. It's not just about what they call sleep hygiene. It's often impacted by our physical, mental, and medical well-being as well. So sleep isn't always behavioral. So it's not always just impacted by the habits that we've formed. Often there's something biological or medical or sometimes even psychological behind the challenges that we're experiencing with sleep. Things like snoring, sleep apnea, where we stop breathing in the middle of the night, headaches, restless leg syndrome, and constipation can all impact sleep. In these cases, the best thing to do is consult your doctor. In our resources page, you're going to find a list of questions that you can ask your physician to help support healthy sleep from a whole body perspective. I once worked with a child who was waking up 4 times per night. It turns out that he had restless leg syndrome. So we knew because some of the behavior, but also because his parents took him to get his blood tested, and they found out he had an iron deficiency. So he went on some supplements and some medication as prescribed by his doctor, and we saw a huge change in the quality and the quantity of his sleep after that. One little solution, it's not a magic pill, but one simple solution that when you talk with your doctors can really help. Additionally, we know that anxiety can impact sleep. The more you worry when either falling asleep or waking up in the middle of the night, and if you have worries, you're going to wake right up and start thinking about them instead of just rolling over and going back to sleep. This is another time to talk with your doctor, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist to figure out what the best strategies are around some of those challenging, anxious behaviors.
So now we can get into some of the strategies that can help sleep. So these strategies can be divided into 4 main areas. So you can make changes in your child's daily routine, in their bedtime, or even in their sleep environment. As well, there are also some strategies that can affect your child's behavior.
So our daily routine, we hear again and again how important it is and how it will impact our sleep. So things like getting 1 to 2 hours of exercise a day, and that's really, really hard exercise. So not just like a very gentle walk to the park, but playing at the park for our kids. We also want to limit, though, that exercise in the hour to 3 hours before bed so that we kind of slow down the body as we get towards bedtime. As we all know, eating a healthy and balanced diet, limiting fat, and limiting caffeine intake are also going to really help our children sleep throughout the whole night. And in those few hours before bed, we do recommend limiting screen time. Now, as a parent, I will say this is hard to do. It's hard in my house as well. So one thing that we also did was we added an app to do a blue light filter on our screen. So if my daughter was watching TV, she had the blue light filtered out to some degree. This also will increase the melatonin, and so in terms will help your child fall asleep quicker.
So the routines we do before bed can also have an impact on your child's sleep. So activities that can include having a small snack, such as a glass of milk, having a bath, using the toilet, brushing their teeth, or even having a bedtime story or a light massage can be part of that routine. And these routines should start around 30 minutes to an hour before bed. So when you're coming up with a bedtime routine, make sure it's soothing and consistent. So we want it to last for about 30 minutes, and this should happen at the same time every day. We also want to limit electronics as the light from the screen can actually be more alerting and keep your child awake. As Anne mentioned earlier, you can look into doing a blue light filter, but that might help with that. You also want to try to limit any extensions. So perhaps your child is asking for one more story or maybe 5 more minutes before they have to go to bed. So in general, the routine should help calm your child down and get their bodies and minds ready for bed.
So picking the right bedtime, picking the time that you're going to choose for your child to fall asleep can be really challenging. We don't want to be too early, because if we go too early and your child's not ready to fall asleep, they're going to learn that their bedroom and their bed specifically is for playing, hanging out in, as opposed to for sleeping. And that's what we really want to teach. Beds are for sleeping. So if it's too late, they could be more overtired, and we're going to either see them run around, race around, and have a really hard time falling asleep because they're so overtired, or the quality of their sleep is actually going to be poor because when you're really overtired, you tend not to spend as much time in that deep sleep that happens before your REM cycle. So we recommend looking at the time of day that they need to wake up and then putting them to bed 8 to 12 hours beforehand. If they need to be up at 7 a.m., they should be going to bed between 7 and 9 p.m. Now, when we first work on falling asleep quickly, we may choose a slightly later bedtime in order to teach them that the bed is for sleeping, not for playing. And then we'll slowly move up the bedtime to a more ideal time. The hardest time for this is going to be on weekends and holidays. So we want to stay up. We, as parents or a family, might want to go out or stay out and visit with friends or family members and put our children to bed later. This sounds great, but this is why we all hate Mondays, because we really mess up our sleep every weekend by staying up late and then sleeping in. So our recommendation, if we don't have very flexible sleepers in our house, is to pick a bedtime and then only change it by an hour on the weekend. So if your bedtime is 7:30 on a Tuesday, on Saturday it's 8:30. And same, if your wake up time is 7 o'clock on a Wednesday, your Sunday wake up time is 8 o'clock.
So the environment or your child's bedroom that he falls asleep in is also important. So just like the bedtime routine, we want to make sure that the sleep environment is a place for relaxing and calming down and not excitement. So your child's room should be comfortable, quiet, dark, not too hot and not too cold. And we also want to avoid having toys or super exciting lights and gadgets in your child's bed, just like the photos on the left. As Anne mentioned, we want your child to learn that beds are for sleeping and not for playing. Sometimes there's things in the environment that you might not realize is actually the key source to your child's sleep challenges. So we once had a child that struggled to fall asleep within 30 minutes of going to bed. So a sleep observation just revealed that the TV that the parents were watching after putting their child to bed was actually a bit too loud for the child. So it was a simple solve. All we had to do was turn the volume down of the TV during the time after the child was put to bed, and all of a sudden he was falling asleep, and sleep was no longer a challenge for this family.
Quick solution.
Yes.
Lots of parents ask us if they should be sleeping in their bed, or if the parents should sleep in the kids' beds, kids should sleep in the parents' bed in the same room. To be quite honest, we don't have much of an opinion on this. The only thing we care about is that everybody sleeps well. So in many cultures and for many families, co-sleeping is a very common and very healthy thing, and we in no way recommend that you change it. The only time we would recommend changing or altering something, maybe even just in the short term, is when sleep becomes a challenge for you and your family. So it's your choice, but if you want them to be able to fall asleep on their own, if you're not sleeping enough because they're tossing and turning, or if they're not sleeping enough because they wake up every time you or possibly your partner snores, then and if they can't fall asleep if you're not there, so you can't get a babysitter or grandma can't watch them because you're not there to help them sleep, that's when we may recommend changing it, even if it's just for the short term, in order to teach them how to fall asleep on their own.
There are things that we need to fall asleep that's often formed out of habits that we call sleep associations. So these can either help us stay asleep or quickly fall asleep when we wake up in the middle of the night. So this can be a favorite stuffed animal, a lovey, having a bottle, white noise in the background, having a dark room, or even having a hand to hold or having your back rubbed. The difference between a good sleep association and a poor sleep association is whether or not your child can use it on their own or access it on their own in the middle of the night. So for example, if your child wakes up, they can easily roll over and grab their favorite stuffed animal, whereas if they're used to having a bottle or a rub, that means they need you, and they'll be waking you up in order for them to fall back asleep in the middle of the night.
So we've talked about your daily routine, the evening and bedtime routine, created an environment that's really sleep-inducing. And now we're going to go into some more in-depth behavior strategies on things you can do to help your children fall asleep and stay asleep throughout the night. Some early strategies to reflect on that are similar to what we already talked about is determining that you have the right amount of sleep required. So we're trying to get 10 hours if our child in general needs 10 hours, or 8 hours if our child only needs 8 hours. Things to do to help that would be to limit napping and to ensure that there's no sleeping in. So the general rule around sleeping in is that even if it's a bad night, we're still waking up at the same regular time, whether that's 7 or 7:30. And on weekends, our recommendation is to change it by about an hour. So, if we normally wake up at 7:30, we can let our kiddos sleep until 8:30 so that everybody has a little bit of a sleep in on the weekends. And most importantly, we really want to reward all good sleep habits for our kids. So that is going to be put into place with every single recommendation we have, or a strategy you can try, is to make sure you're really rewarding your children when they do sleep well, when they do wake up dry in the morning, when they are able to fall asleep just by chance on their own, even if it's just a little, even if you weren't planning for it and it still happens. So this first set of strategies that we'll look at are the strategies that are going to help you target teaching your child to fall asleep on their own. So these strategies can be used even if you're co-sleeping, but it's so that they can fall asleep when you're not there. So you can go out for dinner, go see a friend, come home and know that they were able to fall asleep independently, even if later you're going to still sleep in the same family bed, or if you just want them to sleep on their own through the whole night. There's 3 different ones, either fading your presence, graduated extinction, this is sometimes called controlled cried out, or the Ferberized method in the sleep world, especially with infant sleep, or extinction, which is kind of that straight up cried out method.
So the first strategy is fading your presence. So this means gradually removing yourself from your child's room by increasing the physical distance between you and your child until eventually you aren't in the same room as your child. So in this example, the star represents your position. So typically, if your child needs you to lay beside them and you're touching them in order for them to fall asleep, then the nights 1 to 3, perhaps you are situated in the bed still, but you're not touching them. So that's just a really slight change from touching them in bed to not touching them in bed, just to see if your child's able to fall asleep with that little change. Once they're able to do that, perhaps on nights 4 and 6, you're at the edge of bed or on a chair beside the bed. That way you're still close by, but you're not physically as close to them when you're beside them. And then as your child is able to fall asleep, perhaps you move that chair a bit further away, a meter from the bed, or even just a few feet, depending how your child's reacting. And then eventually, maybe at nights 10 and 12, you're by the door and they're able to fall asleep. And then as you can see, your child will be able to fall asleep knowing you're in the hallway by nights 13 and 15. And hopefully by the middle of the month after trying, you can be anywhere in your house and your child's able to fall asleep. So one of the pros of this strategy is that it's really easy for you to implement. All you're doing is physically getting further and further away from your child. And because this is a lot more gradual, it is less distressing for both yourself and your child, because they can still see you in your in the room, and it's just you're not moving further away until they're ready. Unfortunately, there isn't much evidence in the literature that supports effectiveness with kids with autism. And as you could see from our example, it can take a really long time to eventually get you out of the room. Depending how your child's reacting, you could just be moving inch by inch further away, or maybe feet or meters. It really depends. So this can take a while.
The next strategy we're going to talk about in order to get your child to fall asleep on their own is graduated extinction. So that's a very technical term. In the sleep training world for infants, it's sometimes called controlled cry it out, or the Ferberized method, or something along that line. Basically what we're doing is you're putting your child to bed and leaving the room. When crying or tantruming behavior occurs, you're just going to wait a predetermined amount of time before going back into your child's room. So you often are going to set a timer that says, I'm not going to go back in for at least 5 minutes. With time, if they get out of bed, you're just going to redirect her back to her room without providing any additional attention. At the most, you're going to say it's time for bed, mommy loves you, daddy loves you, go to sleep. And if they appear to be settling down while you're out of the room, you don't go back in. So that's the key. Sometimes it's helpful to have the camera video monitor in those cases so you can see that they're actually calming down, they're settling down, and you would actually reset your timer at that point. Either in the course of the whole night or in the course of different days, you're going to slowly increase the amount of time that you're out of the room and that you're waiting until you go back in. So if it's in this first example, it's over the course of nights. So from nights 1 to 3, you're going to wait 5 minutes before returning to her bedroom to provide about a minute of comfort, and then you leave. And I will say, set the timer for when you're in there, or else you'll stay for 10, 20, 15, 30 minutes. So set a timer. You go in for a minute, maybe 2, and then you leave. Nights 4 to 6, you're going to wait 7 minutes, 7 to 10, 10 minutes, and so forth. However, you could do it over the course of one night. So in night 1, you wait 5 minutes in the first interval, 7 minutes within the second interval, 15 minutes within the third, and so forth. Nights 2, you're actually going to start at a time similar to what you ended with last time. There's, again, pros and cons for this strategy. So graduated extinction or controlled cry it out. Some of the pros are that it's often easier to implement than a straight up, I'm going to let them cry until they fall asleep, or I'm going to let them get upset until they fall asleep. It can be used at a regular bedtime, so you don't have to change your child's bedtime or restrict their sleep. And you get to check in on your child to make sure that they're being, well comforted, and that you can ensure that you also feel comfortable with the strategy you're implementing. Some of the cons, though, are that the results are often slower to achieve than the next strategy we'll talk about, which is just kind of an extinction or actual cry it out. And by going in when they're upset, we may accidentally prolong those tantrums or prolong the time that they're distressed for. And so sometimes what happened, and this happened in my own case when I first sleep trained my child, is that every time I got in, they just got more ramped up and so more upset. And so I actually had to prolong the time even longer between checking in, and they end up falling asleep no problem on their own when I went in less. It's also a little bit difficult to follow through and be really consistent. And so that's why I say it's so important to set the timer for when you're in the room and when you're outside the room, so that you can ensure that you're being as consistent as possible throughout.
So the third strategy is called extinction, or the cry it out method. So this is when you completely ignore any bedtime disruptions, you're not responding to your child's crying or tantrum behavior as long as they're still safe. So basically you just leave the child in her room and then you just leave. You close the door. If your child leaves her room, then you're going to gently escort her back to bed and close the door without talking to her or giving her any attention. So with this, the pros is that we often see the fastest results and it is evidence-based to be effective with our children with autism. But unfortunately, the cons is that we will see a temporary increase in those challenging behaviors because you are just suddenly leaving them all by themselves. So this, of course, may cause distress for your child and for you as well because you need to be on the other side of that door listening to your child become upset. And because of this distress, it is really challenging to follow through consistently. Sometimes it's kind of that battle of who's going to give in sooner, whether it's your kid falling asleep or it's you going back into that room to console your child.
So falling asleep quickly is another goal that you might have. So that's for our kiddos that are taking a long time, 60 minutes to an hour and a half to fall asleep, if not more on their own. They don't know that their bedroom is just for sleep. So in this case, our goal will be for our children to fall asleep within 15 to 30 minutes. We're going to talk about one strategy to help facilitate this, and you can often do it at the same time as the strategies we talked about before. So things that are going to help to make sure that your child is falling asleep quickly are the things we talked about in the beginning of this workshop. Things like reducing naps, ensuring that we're picking the correct amount of sleep for your child to have, limiting screen time before bed, making sure we get lots of exercise and a healthy diet throughout the day. And also one of the most important part, of course, is really creating that soothing bedtime routine. Often with the implementation of those strategies, you're going to find your child falls asleep a lot quicker. And so, for example, I worked with one little boy, we'll call him Timmy. We went into his house and he was typically taking 2 hours to fall asleep. All we did was change that bedtime routine to make it more soothing, and he fell asleep within 15 minutes, not even. We added a massage, a bath, and a little bit of a higher protein-filled snack, and made sure that the lights in the house all were dimmed for when he was falling asleep, and he fell asleep so quickly we didn't even have to do the strategies we're going to talk about next. So the next thing we're going to talk about the strategy we'll recommend in general is bedtime fading. So bedtime fading is basically where we're going to keep our child awake until they're so tired they're just going to fall asleep quickly. We want to really teach that the bed is for sleeping. It's not for playing. It's not for reading tons and tons of books or jumping up and down. So by the time we put you in bed, following a really nice bedtime routine that's very sleep-inducing, you're going to be so tired you just fall asleep. So let's say our child needs to fall asleep at 9 o'clock. You might keep them up to 11 or 11:30, and then slowly you're going to fade bedtime back in 15-minute increments once they learn to fall asleep as soon as you leave the room or within 15 to 30 minutes of you leaving the room. We really need to make sure to wake them up at the normal time though. So this is the hardest part. They are going to be tired. So if 7 a.m. is normal wake up time, you still have to wake them up at 7. And we're going to try and reduce naps as well. So if they don't typically need a nap or if they shouldn't have a nap, we're wanting to make sure that when we start restricting their bedtime, so moving their bedtime later, that we don't add in a nap later on, or we're just going to be at the same point that we were before. And of course, you can do these strategies at the same time as doing the ones to make them fall asleep independently, like I mentioned before. Just slowly moving from 11:30 to 11:15 to 11 o'clock. Every 2 days, 3 days or so, you're moving the bedtime up to what you want it to be at 9 o'clock. And hopefully by then they've learned to fall asleep as soon as you leave the room. Of course, there's pros and cons to everything. One of the pros is that this tends to be errorless, so that means that it's pretty hard to make a mistake here or for our kids to make a mistake. We typically don't see an increase in problem behavior unless they're overtired, and then you might see them get a little bit antsy. And so if they start to get a little bit antsy, that's one of the cons. We want to make sure we're really implementing those stress-free, relaxing bedtime routines. And we often see less distress in this situation. Again, they're not getting too upset about us using the strategy. The cons, you're going to have to keep them awake. So you're going to have to really keep them awake at night. When they're going to be tired, you're going to have to keep them awake, and ideally without screen time, which can be hard. And this can take a few weeks to fully implement and to bring them back to the normal bedtime. So that can take some time too.
So another challenge we might see with our kids is that they have trouble staying asleep through the night. So if your child has difficulty staying asleep through the night, you first want to find the cause of this nighttime waking. So perhaps it's because they wet the bed and that's what wakes them up. Or maybe they are doing those natural partial wakings, but they end up to be a full wake in the middle of the night. Or maybe they're having nightmares, maybe they're hungry, or it could just be other medical reasons that's keeping them awake. You can try one or more of these strategies. So we talked about graduated extinction, or controlled cried out, or extinction, the cried out method, as we mentioned before. But you can also try sleep restriction or scheduled awakening.
So with sleep restriction, what we're trying to do is very similar to bedtime fading, where we're restricting the total amount of time your child is in bed to the total amount of time that they seem to sleep. So if your child, sleeps, let's say they fall asleep quickly, they sleep from 8 till 12, and then they have a party from midnight till 2 in the morning, and then they fall back asleep at 2, and they sleep till 7. So that probably means they need about 9 hours of sleep in order to be happy and healthy throughout the day. And that's the right amount of sleep for them because they're not falling asleep throughout the day or anything like that, or extra grumpy. So you're going to set up a schedule where they actually get a little bit less sleep in the beginning. So similar to bedtime fading, you would either adjust it so that their bedtime is a little bit later or their wake time is a little bit earlier. Typically, we will choose earlier or later bedtime versus an earlier wake time because no one wants to wake up earlier in the morning. If the night waking stops, then you just readjust the bedtime each week by a small amount, again, those 15-minute increments, in order to support them going back to a normal bedtime. But potentially, they actually just need a little bit less sleep. There's some pros and cons, of course, to this. Again, similar to the bedtime fading, this is errorless, it's hard to make a mistake, and we don't tend to see an increase in challenging behaviors or distress. Again, you're either having to wake up later as a con or keep your child up later as a con or wake them up earlier. And it can take a few weeks to really get done. Another con that's not mentioned here on the slide, but can be one, is that it's sometimes hard to find out the exact amount of sleep your child does need.
So our next strategy is called scheduled awakening. So we recommend trying sleep restriction first, and if that doesn't work, then you can try the scheduled awakening. So this is more appropriate if your child consistently wakes up around the same time every night. So for example, maybe every night they're always waking up at 2 a.m. So if that's the case, you can try waking them up about 30 minutes prior to 2 a.m., and this should help reset their sleep cycle. So you want to wake them up just enough so they're able to easily fall back asleep. So the pros and cons of this scheduled awakening is that similar to the other strategies, it is errorless, and we often don't see an increase in problem behavior just because we're just waking them slightly enough that sometimes they're not even consciously aware of that and they're able to fall back asleep more easily. You might even see results in the first night of doing scheduled awakenings, and this strategy also prevents any long bouts of crying or tantrums when they're sleeping. Again, another con for this is it requires someone to be up at night in order to do those scheduled awakenings. And as I mentioned before, your child needs to have that regular, predictable wakings at night. If your child seems to wake up just randomly every other night, then this strategy won't be as appropriate for your child.
All right, so that's a lot of the main behavioral strategies around getting your children to fall asleep and stay asleep. We also want to talk a little bit about nightmares and sleepwalking and night terrors. So nightmares, night terrors, and sleepwalking are 3 other things your children might experience. For nightmares, of course, those are those bad dreams that they have in the middle of the night. You can wake them up from them or not, depending on if it's more disruptive, but often the child will just go back to sleep. They might need a little comfort, a hug, a little bit of a snuggle, and then they can go back to sleep. You can try things like cognitive behavioral therapy around night terrors if your child's able to, or nightmares, if your child's able to understand those strategies. So these things aren't real, the monsters under my bed can't get me, I'll be fine, I'll be safe, all that nice positive self-talk. For night terrors, those are those more intense nightmares, and they're really hard sometimes for a child to get out of. Often you look like you're awake when you're having a night terror. So your eyes might be open, but you're still screaming and moaning and crying. In those cases, you might not want to actually wake them up or provide too much comfort because you being in the room might cause them more distress. So it's one of those things you're going to have to play by ear a little bit and determine whether you stepping in is actually helping or not. Sleepwalking, of course, walking around, sleepwalking, talking, all those kind of things you can do while you're sleeping are another set of challenges that might happen. In this case, there used to be a recommendation that you don't wake up someone if they're sleepwalking. That in general isn't the case anymore. You can wake them up or just gently redirect them back to bed. What's most important is that you make the environment very safe. So you want to block access to stairs, you want to put child locks on things, whatever you need to do to make sure they're not getting into a dangerous situation. So the number one issue with sleepwalking is often stairs. You can try scheduled awakenings with all three of these areas, where you just, again, like Tamara was mentioning, you gently wake them very, very, very gently right before or half an hour before they normally experience one of those three things, especially if they're happening at the same time. What's most important, though, is that sleep begets sleep. And so in these cases, all three are more likely to happen if you're sleep deprived. And so our recommendation is to make sure that your child is getting enough sleep. You're going to see them often on those nights where they have to stay awake too long because we were, out and about and didn't have them home, or when maybe they missed a nap if they still needed a nap, or they had a really bad night's sleep the night before.
So another reason your child could be waking up at night is because they've wet their bed. So typical children usually learn to hold their bladders between the ages of 3 and 5 overnight. But as you can see from these statistics, bedwettings can still be quite common, and the rates just decrease as they get older. And as you know, a lot of our kiddos sometimes aren't toilet trained, and usually date training will come before night training, so it can be quite common. However, there are some other barriers to nighttime continence, and these could include maybe your child is just a really deep sleeper and they're not able to wake up when their body feels those signs and signals that they need to go. Perhaps they're on medications that contribute to nighttime incontinence, or it could just be genetics, the size of their bladder. They're less able to hold their pee throughout the night. Differences in hormones, or just increased caffeine intake during the day can contribute them to wetting the bed. So to address bedwetting, you still want to provide your child with a typical amount of fluid during the day, so that's not something you need to adjust. However, you do want to establish a really good bedtime routine. So that means restricting fluid intake at least 2 hours before going to bed, and always making sure your child is taken to the washroom just before they go to bed. And these quick and easy strategies will just lessen the likelihood that they need to pee in the middle of the night. You can also try the wake up method. So basically, still take them to the bathroom just before bed, and then you want to wake them up and take them to pee around 2 hours after they've been put into bed. If the bed is dry and they pee in the toilet, then you want to provide that reward to let them know that they're doing something good by peeing in the toilet and not in their bed. And if the bed is dry all night, then in the morning your child earns that big reward just so they know that's a behavior you want them to see, right? Keeping their bed dry is really, really good, and they get something great out of that. Depending on how your child is doing, you can either add more wakings or eliminate them. So perhaps you start with every 2 hours you're waking them up, but if they're consistently dry, you can increase the time between the waking, so maybe every 3 hours or 4 hours. And as your child becomes successful, that is when you can gradually fade that reinforcement, just so their body knows to hold it and they're not doing it just because they're getting something good out of it. Another way to address bedwetting is you can use a bed alarm. These have moisture sensors that will go off when your child wets themselves in the middle of the night, and this will just help you track when they're most likely to wet their beds, and then you're more able to use the wake up method to wake them up just before they often pee their beds in the middle of the night. So you can also consider medications to address your child's sleep challenges, if changing their environment and routines, or maybe those behavior strategies aren't working, we just recommend you talk to your doctor or your pharmacist if you're thinking about medications. They might recommend using melatonin or a prescription medication. So melatonin is just one of those sleepy substances that Anne mentioned earlier in this workshop. That helps your body know when it's time to go to bed and helps prepare your body for sleep as well. Or they might recommend a prescription medication if your child has different needs to fall asleep. But we definitely just recommend talking to your doctor or pharmacist about medications.
There's also a lot of other emerging practices. So the things that we spoke about already today, those are all established. They often have evidence or articles and peer-reviewed journals supporting their utilization. And especially with children with autism. However, there's some other emerging practices that exist out there that you might want to think about. So one is bright light therapy, and so that's increasing, especially in Canada, where we have much less access to the sun in the winter. You're really trying to increase the amount of sun exposure or vitamin D during the day in order to help your body build more melatonin that it's going to be using at night to fall asleep and stay asleep. Another one is massages. So massages or any other type of relaxation techniques are established or emerging practices as well. And so something like a gentle massage for your child with lotion right before bed can help, especially if they're younger too, or teaching them how to give themselves a massage or how to put their own lotion on that's in a really soothing way after their bath. Another thing you can do is to build other relaxation strategies. So especially for children who might be feeling anxious about falling asleep on their own or staying asleep, something like either deep breathing right before bed or progressive muscle relaxation where you're slowly tightening the muscles and slowly relaxing the muscles. All those things can help us to decrease our heart rate and soothe our body into a more restful state. Finally, lots of kids like having a transition item or a lovey or a stuffy or whatever you want to call them. There are different teddy bears or something else like that that they can have in replacement for mom and dad or any of their guardians instead. So when they fall asleep, they can always have their little blanket or lovey or stuffed animal instead. And then we love to create a few rules around sleeping. And so having rules like a sleep pass or rules around staying in bed. So something like those lights that, like a grow light that will go bright in the morning when the light turns on. You can leave your room, especially in Canada and northern Canada where we have limited daylight during the winter and too much daylight in the summer. You might want to think about investing in a clock or a light that will go on when they're allowed to leave their room, between 6 and 7 or 8, whatever the morning time is for them. And also a light that will turn off when it's time for them to go to sleep. And that's just a rule that they have to follow, and you just gently redirect them back into their room if they're not following that rule. A sleep pass. So sleep pass is great for either older children or children that have lower support needs. It tells them that they can use it once. So we're going to say to our child, you know what? It's bedtime. You need to stay in bed. But you get this little card, and you can use it once per night to do something. You can either get a glass of water, have mama give you a hug and a quick snuggle, read a quick book, something like that. So the sleep pass would be used just to give them a little bit of a break if they still want to access you once per night. In general, when children learn about the sleep pass, they tend to not want to use it, so they start to hoard it. And then all of a sudden, because they're so afraid, well, maybe I'll need it at 4 in the morning. Meanwhile, of course, they've fallen asleep. They've slept right through 4 in the morning, and so it's not a problem whatsoever. And so we tend to see with the sleep pass that kids go from wanting to come out of bed for a glass of water, for an extra hug, for to check on the toy, to make sure all the lights in the house are out. And they go from having that to 7, 8 times a night they're trying to get up, especially in the beginning, to just getting up once when they're using their sleep pass. And then they're told after the sleep pass is used up, we can't get out of bed anymore. So you're redirecting them back without giving them what they asked for, unless, of course, it's to go to the washroom and they actually need to go to the washroom. And then we tend to see kids stop using the sleep pass. They just are like, oh, I might as well just go to sleep and stay asleep throughout the night. So the last slide here is a bunch of resources, either books or sleep brochures that we would recommend that we took our information from, and a few different articles that support the current findings and recommendations for the treatment of sleep with children with autism. Thank you so much for participating in our workshop, and we hope you learned something new.